All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We may have a few more that will join us in a few minutes here, but I want to keep to our time schedule. So welcome everyone. This is our third webinar this year for the ESTEEM project. Today our focus is really going to be on reflecting on pre-service teachers' work in the ESTEEM modules and their assignments. I hope you can all see my share, right? My shared screen?
Yes.
Good, thank you. So just a reminder, we are recording this session, and it might be helpful if you will mute yourself whenever you're not talking. We will have opportunities for you to share at times throughout the webinar, and we hope you'll participate in those opportunities, but mute yourself otherwise. I'm joined today by Heather Barker. You want to say hi, Heather?
Hi.
Heather is at NC State. She's one of our grad assistants and really helps to be sure that we keep everything running with the ESTEEM team. She keeps us all in line. So
Try very hard.
Go ahead.
I said I try very hard.
And then Christina Asme, who is formerly a grad student at NC State, but now a new faculty member at Catawba College in North Carolina. She is going to be sharing through a video later, a little bit about her experiences. So I want to share a little bit about our goals today. First, we want to learn the context and purpose of the two assignments that are a part of our ESTEEM materials, the Screencast Assignment and the Tasteign assignment. We'll have some time to examine pre-service teachers' work on an investigation of roller coasters that comes from the foundation module. We'll share some examples of student screencasts, and by student screencasts, we're talking about pre-service teacher screencasts, and discuss how pre-service teachers use CODAP. We'll discuss the Tasteign assignment and what we have noticed about our pre-service teachers through their submissions. And then we'll have an opportunity to listen to Christina's experiences with implementing the Screencast assignment, followed by some opportunities for questions and discussion. You know, if you've implemented these assignments before, we encourage you to try to share your experiences throughout. We'll have opportunities. And we'd like to hear whether your experiences have been similar to ours or how they might be different. This workshop, we kind of are thinking in terms of just as it's important for pre-service teachers and practicing teachers for that matter to reflect on student thinking, we really think it's important that we as math teacher educators think about pre-service teachers thinking and in the ways that they're interacting with the content in our ESTEEM materials. So that kind of is the driving force behind this webinar. So as a reminder, if you would like to access our ESTEEM materials, remember you can go to theplace.fi.ncsu.edu and you should be able to get there. And I'll be putting those links in just a minute in the chat box as well. So if you'd just like to click on them, they'll be there in just a minute. Okay, Heather.
All right. So I'm going to, let me share my screen really quick too. Those of you that have already implemented the materials will be familiar with our modular approach. But just to remind you, we have 3 modules in the ESTEEM materials. So the foundation module covers core ideas about teaching statistics, how it's different from math, how math and statistics differ, things about the statistical investigation cycle, and introducing students to using CODAP or pre-service teachers. And then we also have 2 other modules, a teaching inferential reasoning module and teaching statistical association module that were released last year. For those modules, they all have CODAP incorporated throughout them with different ways that the pre-service teachers can use CODAP in their classrooms. But today what we're going to be talking about are the assignments that are part of the module. So Rick's actually going to talk about one of the assignments that we use in the foundation module. And we're also going to talk about the screencast and task design assignment. So for the screencast assignment, teachers or math teacher educators, excuse the language here, can implement it after the foundation module or either the other two modules that they want to. And we're going to go through a review of what the screencast assignment is in just a minute. And then also the task design assignment, we recommend that people implement that one after either doing the inferential reasoning or the association module. It's a little hard to implement right after the foundation module, though some people have, but we highly recommend that you do it after teaching at least two of the modules. So for the screencast assignment, if you haven't had it pulled up before, I'll leave this here too, but if you go to this link, we can look at the screencast assignment. So the purpose of this assignment, so again, it's tinyurl.com/ESTEEM screencast. So here the purpose is to demonstrate their ability to look at a statistical investigation using CODAP. So here we're not concerned with the pre-service teachers being able to teach students how to use CODAP. It's more a way for the instructors, math teacher educators to look and see how the students are using the CODAP itself in an actual screencast. I'll go into more detail about the choices that we have for data sets currently. It has changed some. If anybody's implemented the screencast assignment before, we did have roller coasters data set and a vehicles data set here, as well as a state education data set. We decided to change those in our last iteration because we look at the roller coaster assignment a lot in module 1. Vehicles comes up in the association and the inferential reasoning module, so we decided to give people more data sets in order to look at for the screencast assignment. And then the task design assignment, here's another link for that one in case you want to open it. And I think Rick's putting these in the chat window too. So the task design assignment is a bit beefier than the screencast assignment. For this one, we were purposeful in having a task design and not a lesson plan. So it's important for students to be able to engage in creating tasks. There are 6 parts to the task design assignment. They have an introductory information just about the assignment. They turn in a student guide or handout of the task, what would actually go to the students, what the pre-service teachers are preparing for a student. Things about they would anticipate students' work, so what they would envision a student turning in. Notes to another teacher or someone else for implementing the task, and then a short reflection on what they would do. So here we also have links to an example of a CODAP-enabled task. So we decided to put that in to help PSTs figure out how to do this sort of assignment, try to give them little taste of how to do it. So, and again, Rick's gonna go into a little bit more detail of this when we talk about the task design assignment. Okay, so I'm gonna stop and turn it over to Rick. Did I stop? No, I didn't stop.
Okay. So students first investigate the roller coaster assignment in the foundation module. You may recall that there are 2 different data sets. The first data set involves a group of 31 older roller coasters, and by older roller coasters, we're talking about those that were built before 1980. Then in part 2 of the foundation module, students investigate a much larger data set with more variables and newer coasters. So these are likely pre-service teachers' first experiences with using CODAP. So the goal is sort of twofold for the roller coaster investigations. One is to engage in true data exploration, and then also it's to try to learn to use CODAP as a new tool. And so today we'll be exploring some of the students' thinking from the roller coaster assignment. So one of the earliest questions that pre-service teachers are asked involves naming the coaster with the tallest height and then identifying the maximum height. So this seemed to me initially as a very straightforward question. I didn't anticipate that students would have any difficulties with this. However, when I gave this to my class this semester, just a few weeks ago actually, I noticed more than one of my students, I had 2 or 3 students that were making the same mistake within the first few minutes of the investigation. So I want to open this up for discussion. Do you have any ideas about what mistake a student might make in this fairly straightforward question. Any guesses out there?
I'm guessing that they might not see all the data points, so they will see whatever points are showing on the screen, not be sure that they are seeing the whole. So then they will figure out that whatever they are seeing is the tallest.
So part of it might be not visible within the
But not also not thinking about the data points is larger or.
So I'm going to give you a picture here that we'll see if you think this is what they were thinking.
Okay.
So I had a lot of students that, well, I shouldn't say a lot, but 2 or 3 that were responding, I think it's revolution. And you can see what they were choosing when they looked at the graph. They clicked on the highest data point visually. However, this represents the most frequent height, right? Not the highest height.
Yeah.
And so, this is a mistake that actually would be quite common for K-12 students that were learning to interpret dot plots. But I think it's a good conversation to have with students because it is a common mistake that could happen in the context of teaching. I've also wondered about this data set in particular because we're using the term max height, right? It's the height of the roller coaster. I've wondered if the context at all might have impacted how students responded to this question. And so, we were looking for the roller coaster that's up there around 150 as the answer, but of course there were some that were making a mistake here. So as we continue on, like I said, part of our goal is to think about how we support these new users of CODAP in this first roller coaster assignment. So to investigate sort of the range of student responses to a single question, we're going to take a look at 5 different responses to this question. Are there differences or similarities between the track links for older coasters that are made of different material, such as wood or steel? And this is number 8 on that first roller coaster assignment. When I'm teaching this, I try to make clear to my students that are completing this assignment that they need to include screenshots of their work. And sometimes they need support to do that, right? Sometimes they need to be taught how they can do that. So I'm going to give you some examples. And I'm going to warn you that I'm going to ask you what you notice about the differences between these responses. So I encourage you to attend to the responses. Think about their differences as I reveal them here. So here's the first one. It says the steel coasters are generally shorter in length than the wood coasters. Wood coasters are generally the same length. They are distributed across the graph in a way that reflects these answers. Okay, here's the second response. The coaster with the longest track length is wooden, while the shortest track length is steel. While the average wooden coaster length is 3,063 and the average steel coaster length is 2,138. Here's a third response. The track lengths for older coasters don't go above 2,800 feet. This is near the middle, but it's in the lower length of the track length. The lowest the track length goes is 2,132 feet. And the lowest on the entire graph is 200 feet. So mainly the older coasters have a smaller track length compared to the newer coasters. I'm going to give you a few minutes for you to take a look across these 3. And I'd like for you to share what you notice as differences about the responses. I think it's quite clear that there are definitely different ways that they visually represented the data. If you look at the first graph, it's a dot plot enhanced with color. Second graph, it's a similar dot plot, but with an overlaid text box or box plot, mean and median. And then the third representation is a scatter plot that's enhanced with color. So what do you notice about these differences? And if you were working with these pre-service teachers, what might you ask or say to them to further their thinking? I'll give you a few minutes to think, and then when you feel like you're ready to respond, feel free to share your thinking. Anybody want to share?
Well, one thing, this is John, one thing I notice is that the descriptions don't really precisely match the graphs in a lot of cases. It seems like they're not being very precise with the wording and how that's reflected in how their claim is being reflected in the graph. And it makes me wonder if they are seeing things in CODAP, using, hovering over points and having information pop up, and then they're just taking a screenshot that doesn't contain the information that they seem to have referred to come to their conclusions.
Was there a particular graph that you felt that was strong for?
Well, I guess there are a couple of things that stood out there. It says the average coaster, wooden coaster versus the average steel coaster in the middle graph. That information is not clearly displayed as far as I can tell in the middle graph. It looks like they're showing the mean and median for just the overall. Is that what those vertical lines and the box plots show?
You're right. In the middle graph, there really isn't, the picture is not really a good representation of the claims that are being made, right?
Right. That's a nice example of it, where they're making claims, but it's not really being supported by the graph they've included.
Yeah. So I agree. I think that's something that we can attend to in working with students, right? Choosing a graph to share that makes sense given the claims that they're trying to make, right? What other things do you notice?
So one thing that I'm seeing this is Kimberly, in the third graph with the scatter plot is there was an opportunity that was missed by adding that categorical variable of the type of coaster, wood or steel, and it could have changed that graph quite significantly so that we could actually probably identify if it was wood or steel. They didn't even go into that on that third graph, but that's a missed opportunity right there. That was cool that they decided to go scatter plot, but adding that categorical variable in there would have been a really good addition.
Yeah, I have to be honest, the third one I was really surprised. Like, I think sometimes students can get caught up with the bells and whistles in CODAP, right? They can create a lot of new things in CODAP and they create a representation. And maybe they find something like John was sharing, they may find something and then they move on, right? And so, yeah, the picture as well as the description there really didn't focus on the ideas that they were made of different material. One of the common things I have seen a problem with this, and it deals with the context. Remember I said earlier that we identified this was a sample of older coasters built before 1980. And I feel like that sometimes pre-service teachers look at year opened thinking that represents older coasters, but really how we describe it, all of these are older coasters, right? That's how we define them, how we selected them to share as we narrow them down, right? Because if you remember, the larger data set has more recent roller coasters. Anything else anyone's seeing? Nobody's mentioned the first graph. Anything you see in the first graph? One of the things I was curious about, this last sentence in the first graph, they are distributed across the graph in a way that reflects these answers. Can you elaborate? I mean, I would want to elaborate. What does that mean out there? Does anybody have an idea? I'll be honest, I don't know. That's part of the question I would ask students I know. What does it mean to be distributed across the graph?
I thought that same thing. I thought that's an interesting last sentence. What the yellow dots are further to the right than the purple dots. I mean, I don't, I'm not sure, but that's what it seems to be.
Yeah. Right, I have a couple of other examples that I'd like to share with you here too. Most of the track lengths are below about 4,500 feet, with one wooden coaster that is an outlier on the graph. It has a track length above 7,000. So you can look, track length, they've identified the different coasters, colored them using wood and steel. And then our second graph on the right here, the response there says the wooden coasters tend to be longer. Their median is 2,767 feet long, while the steel coaster's median is 2,130 feet long. The wooden coasters have one outlier, where it is much longer than the rest of them. I'll be honest, my gut reaction was that if I were to answer this question, I would probably create a graph like the one on the right, to create a representation like that. And maybe that's my own like personal preference, how I typically work in CODAP. But there were only 3 students that really created a stacked dot plot like that. So I'm curious, what do you see across these two? Would you have answered the question? And I can go back to the question if we need to. Are there similarity or differences or similarities between the track lengths that are made of different material? I'm curious to hear from all of you. Would you have created one like I would have? The one on the right, or would you have created something similar to some of the others made here?
I would have done the one on the right as well. We've actually created that one in my class before.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You're asking a question about differences between two grouping or two levels of a grouping variables, right? So you want to group by those variables and see how the distributions vary. It's not, we used CODAP with a group of 8th graders just recently, and it's part of what I'm seeing in both the graph on the left and some of the ones on the previous slide was reflected in what we saw in the 8th graders' work, some of the 8th graders, in that you can just drag any variable you want to any part of the graph and just see what it does. And sometimes I think one of the potential drawbacks to software like CODAP seems to be that students don't think very much about what sort of graph would be appropriate before they dive in and start creating graphs. And then they see something that looks kind of neat and they say, that's my screenshot. Even the list of the coaster names on the left-hand side of the graph on the left, on the y-axis or vertical axis, doesn't really make a lot of sense as a variable, for creating the graph. But it's there, and it's easy for students to create it. And I question sometimes why they made the decisions they made. What were they trying to show by having that variable being displayed on the graph?
I included the graph on the left for a reason. I find that early on when students are using CODAP, they often want to look at those individual cases, right? That's something that we see across a lot of research and statistics education, is that often students look at individual cases before they start to see the aggregate of the data, right? And so I feel like that when they are looking at those coaster names, they're kind of focusing on the individual cases at times. And I guarantee almost every time I've done this assignment, I have someone that looks at the individual cases in some way like this.
I agree. I've had students look at the individual cases like that as well. First off, what I normally do is I just let them create graphs and they like play with it for an extended period of time. That way they can come up with which ones can actually give them information and which ones can't.
So before we move on, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say that I teach K-8 pre-service teachers, and we do this investigation, and there will always be pre-service teachers that make a graph like the one on the left, as well as the first one. Hold on a second. I'm sorry, that's me. Okay, didn't know that. Sorry. Anyways, I think I just try to highlight what we can see from that graph that's different than the other graphs. And I really try to steer my pre-service teachers away from box plots because they don't understand them. And they'll kind of glom on to median and IQR and box plots, and they're not usually able to reason about those measures. So I stay informal and kind of exploring data for most of the time with my pre-service teachers. And only at the very, very end talk about measures of center and variation and representations like this.
I like how you frame that, Marianne, in terms of just letting them explore and see what kind of graphs can be useful for answering the question. What's missing is, to me, the graph on the left doesn't really help us answer the question that was posed, but then to have a discussion about that, right? How could we get better information from this graph that would help us distinguish between the wooden and the steel coasters?
I think you can look at that graph and see the purple dots are kind of more tightly together, and the yellow dots are kind of have more variation, and there's a tendency in there, but I think you could easily go into a conversation about what kind of graph might show that better, because it is kind of hard to see that. But I mean, I think you can transition from that graph.
Yeah.
I think that's a great idea, both of those discussed, because it helps build up that thought process of transenumeration and that, like, what best answers the question that we're trying to investigate.
Before we move on, I'd like anybody else to share opportunities, share your experiences, I guess, about your students, your pre-service teachers, learning to use CODAP. Have there been experiences that have been positive or negative? Like I said, this roller coaster assignment tends to be their first time they're using it. So I'd like to hear from anybody else that would like to share. What frustrations have you seen with students or misunderstandings?
Well, I guess I'll speak. I was working with in-service teachers in an online, like purely online setting, and they honestly got a little frustrated with trying to learn CODAP and not having great instructions on it, which I thought was fascinating and might contrast from how maybe their students might experience the use of CODAP for the first time.
Jenny, can you say anything about what frustrated them? Were they trying to create graphs that weren't possible to create, or?
For a lot of them, quite a few went to regression because many were middle and high school teachers, and that's what they teach, and they wanted to do extra things that CODAP either didn't allow or required a lot of more digging, and so there were some kind of frustrations in that. And because it was a purely online setting, it was hard, and I was teaching it for the first time, it was hard to know, like, what's the best way to support them in that kind of learning environment when it's asynchronous.
Anyone else have frustrations with students learning CODAP?
Recently, I've been using it quite a bit with my elementary educator, pre-service teachers, and they really struggle with loading data into CODAP, like CSV files and loading it in. And then we had problems with dollar signs coming into CODAP. And like it was, I guess, making it categorical. And even though I tried to change the data type to quantitative, I think the data disappeared. And maybe I did something wrong, Rick, but just in general, loading data in, you know, and I think that's probably true of in-service teachers too. Like they really like it when the data sets are there, you know, and just that extra piece just seems to really throw them.
Right.
So we've collected some data and using a Google Sheets file, and you can export an individual sheet to a CSV, and then that kind of downloads into your browser tab, and then you can drag it into a CODAP window. And that was pretty easy for us to do, but we had to do some processing of the data first, which kind of messed things. So we had capital YES and then some lowercase YES, and then capital Y and then lowercase e and lowercase s, and those are all treated differently in CODAP. And so we had to do some pre-processing, which I just took onto myself. You know, after I dragged it in and saw what it looked like, he said, "Well, just give me a minute. I'll add a formula here in this sheet and convert everything to lowercase," and then it worked fine. But it was, you know, there's always data processing that you have to learn how to do. And I think you're right to point out that people who are new to software can get pretty frustrated pretty quickly when those little, you know, wrenches get thrown into the works. So it just points to the importance of having a good, clean kind of process for how we're going to record data and so on too, if you don't want to have to process it yourself.
And we'll share a little bit in the task design about how messy data has impacted some pre-service teachers' tasks too. I mean, I do think it's good for pre-service teachers to recognize that data is often messy. You do often have to clean it, and you know that's a part of the data science, right? It's part of the data handling process, is that we have to try to manage it. Before we move on, I'm going to take an opportunity to mention a couple things, and they're not really intended to be part of this session, but within the last couple of weeks, if you've used CODAP, you may have noticed there were some changes. One thing is that CODAP is now able to create histograms. And so if you have a quantitative attribute, you can tell it to fuse at that point, and it will create histograms. Another thing, Bill hadn't shared this with us, but I noticed it today, and you can actually see it on the graph here on the right. Formerly, CODAP usually gave you outliers in a box plot, like they would show, you know, a little point, little plus sign, I think, if it was an outlier. And you can actually choose now whether you want to show outliers as part of the box plot or not. And so, you know, these are not showing outliers within the box plot. I think that's the default now. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Heather to share a little bit about the screencast assignment.
Rick, one other thought there on CODAP. When students take screenshots, you can't see the pop-up tabs. You know, if you hover over the median line, it'll show what the value is. And I don't know of a way to do that with CODAP. That might be just a suggestion. I know I can submit suggestions through the CODAP interface itself, but if they're going to display a median line, say for a data set, it would be nice if you could turn labels on for that, so that when you take screenshots, they show up in the reports.
You know, that's an interesting idea, and we'll share that with Bill.
Sure.
I'm over here taking notes as you guys talk too. All right, so I'm going to share some on the screencast assignment. So it's a little bit, someone said earlier that somebody said that it was hard to tell what they're trying to show, or like why they might have had these different screenshots to support their work. I think the screencast assignment gives us a little bit more insight into what they're actually trying to show, which is a little bit nicer. We have collected about 90 screencast assignments from different instructors. If you are implementing ESTEEM this semester and are planning on doing the screencast assignment, we'd really appreciate if you do share with us in the data collection these screencasts, because they are very interesting to see what insight pre-service teachers have when they're using CODAP. So why use a screencast assignment? So we should always make sure that our students, our pre-service teachers, are engaging in tasks that similar to the ones that they're going to be sharing out in their own classrooms. So it is important for them to actually engage in the investigations that they may one day do. We also have seen that the technology that teachers use in the classroom is a bit stagnant. So a lot of times teachers are still using TI-84 calculators. someone mentioned still using regression models and that sort of thing is kind of their go-to. But if we're not using different technologies in teacher education programs, then it makes sense that they're not being used in the classroom itself. So we want to make sure that we're using those. And also the Statistical Education and Teachers Report recommends that we do use dynamic statistical software such as CODAP in order to help with the statistical investigation cycle and to help teachers engage in that process. So what I'm going to do here is, first of all, go through some of the data, well, one of the data sets that we have. So for the screencast assignment, we have one of 3 data sets and different sets of questions with each one. I'm going to be sharing with you 3 examples of student screencasts that engage in the state education data. But just to show you something a little different, this NHANES data set is from the U.S. Health and Nutrition data. It's a National Health and Nutrition Survey that was done in 2003. I'm just going to open that for you here so you can kind of see it. It's a little bit different than other CODAP examples if you've seen the examples that are available on the CODAP website. This one is there too, so if you go into the examples set, you can look up NHANES and you'll find it. But what it does is if you have, you can get any sample of people, so you can, I'm not sure what the total number is, but you can go pretty high here on the total sample that you can get. But when you press the button here, you'll get a random sample of 10 Americans of all ages from this NHANES data set. The default variables are education, marital, gender, age, race, BMI, height, and weight. But the neat thing about this data set is if you go under options, there's a lot more attributes you can choose. So these are the default ones that if I just chose a random sample here, I would get that. But I can also go under, let's say, demography, for example, and look up poverty of people, household incomes, age. I can go under here under body measurements, get all types of different measurements. Blood pressure is one of the ones that you can look at. Biochemistry, it has cholesterol levels on there, glucose levels. You can start talking about diabetic things, that sort of stuff. Sexual behaviors on there, that sort of thing. So the questions that we have in the screencast assignment, this was purposeful here. We have 2 questions they could explore. Relationships between women who are pregnant and their age and other variables and what trends you might notice. Others that are anemic. We chose these because they're actually the questions that are here that they have data challenges. Because this, I think this is actually my pushing, because I feel like if students would, or pre-service teachers would see these questions here, they would think automatically they're the ones they should answer. So we just stuck with the ones that they have here. But just let me show you one. So one of the ones we have is asking about pregnancy and some other things that go on. So we do look at household income. Get a sample, maybe kind of a large one, not everyone's right. And we can just get our sample. And so then we can just play with the sample much like we do with any of the other data sets we have. So it's kind of a fun data set. We haven't got any screencast assignments using the NHANES data set yet, but if some people do decide to use the screencast assignment this semester, this is one of the possible ones that we could look at. So like this one, for example, said look at household income and whether you're pregnant or not, or the pregnancy as household income. And I confused those. So this is kind of just an example of what you can do. I was playing with this earlier and then tried to see if gender had anything to do with pregnancy before I realized, oh wait, there's only one gender that can get pregnant. So
Heather, so the income, I've tried to use this data set before. So the income levels there, are those treated as categorical?
Yeah. They are categorical in this case. So yeah, it's not like it's going to not be a quantitative variable there. Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, but there are quantitative variables in there, but yeah, you can see here how they have it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I was playing with that too, Marianne. I was like hoping it wouldn't be categorical and I could do some sort of version, but yeah, it is categorical there. So
okay,
that's another fun data set. We also have here the ESTEEM birthday data. This is one of Rick's favorites that we look at. It's a really neat data set too. But today what I'm going to look at is the state education data sets. So this is one that was part of the original screencast assignment. We asked students to consider if they were going to try to live in the South or the West of the United States because they have the best weather. Where would you prefer to teach and why? So I'm going to look at 3 screencasts, just little segments of the screencast of students answering this question and different ways that they answered it, and see if we can have some discussions about how CODAP is being used by these students. So let me play this one and make it bigger. And while you're watching this, I've got some different questions here. And I do want to have a bigger conversation at the end, but let's try to focus on like each individual screencast after we play it and just have maybe a couple things to say afterwards. Someone said earlier, I don't know if it was John or not, but some things in CODAP might actually support or hinder their thinking. So sometimes they might have too much options and it might, they lose what they're actually trying to say. So let's look at this example and try to think about what features and actions will actually support the pre-service future statistical thinking. So let me make this one bigger so you guys can see it. Turn it up.
For salaries. But the one thing that's really I found really interesting when I was looking at this was actually looking at the box plots. And something you might notice here is that if you interpreting this box plot correctly, 50% of the data points should be above the median. And you'll notice that like for the West, the median is the median of the West is higher than the upper bound for the South. So there's these three outliers here, but where the most of the data is less than what 50% of the West is. So like 50%. If you were to just randomly choose a state in the West, you would have a 50% chance of getting a state with a higher average salary than almost all of the states in the South, which I found really interesting. And also another thing that I found interesting, we just want to like check this out for a little bit. You might think that like seems a little different to me, was that if you look at these three outliers here for the South, which seem to match up pretty closely to data in the West, at least the upper data in the West. This one is I believe Delaware. This one is Maryland, and this one is DC. So it's just these three areas right here, states and district, you know. And actually, like, if we could just like hide these just for a minute. You'll notice that like the median goes down and it's considerably lower. Like if you were to randomly choose a state in the West now, you would have a 50% chance of getting a state with a higher average salary than all of the average salaries of all of the states in the South. So that's really interesting. And the reason that I think that's interesting is because these three states are all right next to each other, and like Maryland, Delaware, and DC are kind of like sometimes considered like northern states. Like to me, I've always kind of considered Delaware to be a more northern state. Maryland's still southern, but like it was part of the Union in the Civil War, I think.
All right, so thinking about that one, and just to give you a little, I can give you context on this one because it's kind of hard to hide the MyPack there, but this is a student that would have been in the middle, the secondary pre-service teachers class. So this is somebody that's not the K through 8 strand. I can't tell you that on the other ones because I was choosing Screencast are already blinded, so I'm not sure where they came from, but I do know this one was the secondary methods class. So let's think about how they use the features and actions in CODAP and how it supported his thinking. And I can't
repeat your question.
Yeah, you share anything you want to about this one, but if it helps to think about it, what features and actions in CODAP did this teacher use to support their thinking or might have hindered their thinking? And I can tell you, he eventually decided he wanted to teach in the West because it made more money.
I felt that the student really understood the data well. I think it's very easy to get confused when you're looking at medians and box plots of average salaries. And he seemed to have a very firm grasp on what all that data was representing, which is great.
Yeah, I thought it interesting when you mentioned that your K through 8 teachers, you don't let them use box plots as much because they don't really understand it. But I think that this student really did understand what the box plot was trying to tell them in terms of the data. Yeah. Okay. Anything else?
Along the same lines, I think, doesn't the research suggest that students who are looking at box plots should always see that overlaid with the dot plot itself, at least initially, so they can kind of start to see those connections? And CODAP seemed to support his ability to do that here. Had both graphs kind of displayed, and then was able to kind of highlight or shake his cursor at different points that were hidden behind the box plot.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed like that helped him explain what was going on. I was also impressed with the use of the map feature. I haven't personally found a use for that, and I honestly don't know quite how it works. But he seemed to use that to good effect here to explain some of the context.
Yeah, definitely. The map feature is really powerful, but you're right, if you know how to use it, right? So I remember we this one, Rick probably can talk to this more, but we had to use like some sort of like latitude and longitude measurements in order to get the right states in there. So yeah, definitely could use a tutorial on how to do that. Okay, so let's look at the next one. I've got 2 more, so I do want to go through them a little bit quicker here. Sorry, I lost my mouse. All right, so let's look at this one. So let's think here about how she interprets this question a little bit differently and how she used CODAP to aid her understanding. This one's a little bit shorter.
Okay, so here
Sorry, it's funny, Rick and I picked similar examples in different contexts.
Okay, so here I have the education data sorted out by states, and I want to figure out where I would want to teach based on teacher salary in the South and West. So to find that, I am going to add the average salary to my chart or my graph. And I am going to also add states to my graph at the bottom on the x-axis. And I want to sort this so I can only get the South and the West on my chart or my graph. So I'm going to add the region and sort it by region by colors. And I'm going to click on the Northeast and hide those cases. I'm going to do the same for the Midwest. So now I am left with the average salary for each state in the West and the South. So according to this information, the District of Columbia has the highest average teacher salary at over $73,000. And so looking at just this information, I would prefer to teach in the District of Columbia because of course you'd want to make more money. And the next closest is California with 71. Obviously I want to teach in Mississippi because it has a very low average salary. But you can't only focus on salary. There's a lot of other components over here that you need to look at to see where you'd want to teach, and also just general prior conception.
Okay, and so she goes on and talks about those different things to answer the second question. I will tell you that she does go on and chooses this point here is also another good salary, but this point here is Alaska, and she decided she didn't want to teach there because it's too cold. So she used some data that wasn't a part of the data set itself. All right, so let's think about here how this person used CODAP differently and maybe how they understood the question as well. So the question too, I had to go back because when I was doing this, I'm like, what? Let me read this question again and see if maybe we just wrote it poorly. But it's based on the average year salaries for states in the South and West. Where would you prefer to teach and why? Oh, sorry, let me go back here.
I wonder if you asked them that question before they saw the data and they wrote down their ideas, and then after the analysis, if they wrote down, because if maybe their ideas aren't changing at all, that'd be interesting to know.
Oh yeah, like a hypothesis and then support it with yeah, that would be interesting.
She was discarding states pretty fast,
Yeah, yeah, she was. Yeah, she picked the highest and the lowest is out. Yep. Yeah.
It's surprising that nobody's noticing the cost of living kind of factors that go into this. DC is a pretty expensive place to live. Alaska is a pretty expensive place to live, and they're totally discounting that other side of the equation.
Yeah, and I've watched a lot of these screencasts, and a few of them will talk about that, but maybe it's just that they don't know that yet. Maybe they're just not something they consider. But yeah, that's definitely, it's not part of this data set either, but it's only mentioned occasionally. Any other things you want to think about to this one? I've got one more I want to share.
Well, the question does kind of point them in that direction, right? In fairness to them.
Yes. Yeah, that's what, when I was watching this, I'm like, well, in fairness, it says, where do you want to live? It doesn't say which region, right? So if we want to clearly talk about which region, we should have said, which region would you prefer to teach in and why? So she was clearly pointing out, well, I'll tell you which state I want to teach in.
It does refer to average teacher salaries, but also some other variables. Did you get a lot of students looking at things like student-teacher ratios and so on as part of that, or did they just focus on the salaries?
Yeah, so the next biggest one that they looked at for all the other data in here was student-teacher ratio. That was the biggest other one they used as an argument to where they wanted to teach. I don't have it shared here, but hopefully, I was spitballing research things with Rick yesterday. It would be interesting to look at what they're using to support themselves. But I had a few people that would do a graph, like they would look at average teacher salary as a scatter plot against student-teacher ratios, and that was another way that they would argue about it. The first screencast example I showed you, he actually created a formula to look at the average student ratio and multiply it by the number of teachers to figure out how many students were in each state. So that was interesting that they used that as a data point too. So yeah, it's a lot of interesting stuff going on in just this 10 minutes of video that they share with us. Any other things you want to share about that one?
It's just nice to see their thinking in action.
Yeah, it's really powerful. It is. It's really, I love watching these screencasts.
One of the things that I've noticed in my students that do the screencasts, they behave in ways that I don't behave at times. For example, when I'm in CODAP, I typically click on the attribute name and drag down and into the graph. Whereas I find a lot of my students were clicking on the graph where you can bring down a drop-down menu and choose the attribute. And I think it goes back to, I was a Tinkerplots Fathom user where that was not an option. And I think that's one of the differences. They're behaving differently because they were not Tinkerplots Fathom users in the past, right? Yeah. And so I attribute the difference to that, I guess.
Yeah, and like Rick was noticing in that first example, he would have highlighted all three of the outliers or removed them at once, but instead that student removed them one at a time. And I see that happening a lot. Like when they want to remove or add cases, they'll do it one at a time. And I've even seen somebody, when they want to isolate the regions, they don't realize that there's a whole census region section, and they will go through line by line and like control click to find which ones are the South or the West, instead of actually like, I think maybe they're used to Excel or something. But yeah, it's interesting to see the different ways that they even arrange data. Okay, so let's look at one more example. It's a totally different way of looking at this question, which this example was a nice way to round out these three. So for this one, let's just think about different representations that might help them answer this statistical investigation. So let me make it bigger. Okay, there we go. I have too many Zoom buttons open here. There we go.
To investigate which region I would prefer to teach in based on the salary, the average teacher's salary. So I'm gonna get two maps.
This one clicks very loud.
One will show the region, and the other one's gonna show average salary for teachers. So this region right here, you can see the South, and this region, including Alaska, is considered the West. So if I look at this map, I can see that the South has the lower ends of the salaries, and the West has the higher ends of the salary. So based on the average salary, I would prefer to teach in the West because they have the more variety of the higher pay than the South, but the South has no higher paying salaries.
Okay.
So the next.
All right. So much different way of looking at that question there. So what do you guys notice about this or find interesting here with this PST's experience with it? I know when I found this one, I was excited. I was like, oh, this is probably one of the only ones that I saw do it this way.
Yeah, I was pretty impressed with that one. I thought that's a really neat use of the graph and a nice way to see the visual trend geographically organized.
Yeah.
I also noticed Michigan was right there, nice and dark brown, which is where I'm from, and pretty pleased to see the high teacher salaries there. Student didn't point that out. I thought I would in this chat. Go Michigan.
Well, and you know, you're doing just like students do. A lot of times they love to see those cases. Like
Yeah, you got to look at your own case. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Anything else? Anything they're not
in the chat box. You might.
Oh, sorry. I missed you about the chat box. Oh, sorry. Let me go back to my here.
So I can read it.
Thank you.
She can't talk, but she, because the question lists 3 of the variables, she wonders if they think they might have to plot 3 variables. She says that seems counterintuitive to me, but for somebody trying to meet a teacher's criteria, she wonders, I assume, she wonders if it's a good thing for them to try to do. I hope that's right, Cami.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it's not, they're probably not used to being able to plot 3 variables either. That's looking at the other screen, that example, I assume. Is there, for this one, I don't, if you all have experience with the shaded area in the graph, I think that they missed out on the opportunity if they would have clicked on the little area that, you know, if they have the graph, if they would click on like the lower bound or whatever, or the upper bound, then they could have showed easily, you know, like there's no dark ones here and only light ones here, that sort of thing. Like I kept hoping that she would push on that and showcase it a little bit better, but I still think that they made a good argument there, because if you'd have clicked on here, you would have seen the teeny tiny little DC one there. But that was missed. Because they just bring them all together. So just thinking in general of screencasts or any other opportunities. So what do you think maybe these screencasts can tell us about the readiness of Preservice teachers to do statistical investigations with CODAP with their own students? Someone else just put something in the chat. Let me.
I think you can refer to these screencasts or any that you've done. If some of you have implemented the screencasts, feel free to share about how they've told you about the readiness of your pre-service teachers.
And Cami again said that I just find students read the question very literally, and I think that sometimes hampers their ability to think critically. What I'd love to see is a student use this third student's approach to quickly get a sense for where salaries are higher, but then go into more detailed analysis like the first one. Yeah, I agree, Cami. And I think too that when you look at that sort of picture, isn't that the ones we see in media nowadays? Like you see those sort of graphics that have like the pictures of a map that show the things. And I feel like they see that more often now, even though they're not utilizing it in the screencasts themselves. John said triangulation. Yes, John.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like a wanting to get it done issue, or, you know, I feel like sometimes students are like so rushed. There's like check, like I answered the question. Getting them to slow down, whether it's regardless of what grade they're going to teach or teaching, getting them to slow down and really enjoy the data is hard.
For sure. And we do limit them in this one too. We do say they should keep their screencasts under 10 minutes. So if they haven't practiced first, then they are limited, because It depends on the instructor. I will talk about this a little bit later, but some instructors tell them they should practice beforehand, so you can tell it's a bit scripted. For some instructors, you can tell it's a true investigation, where it might be the first time they're actually diving into the data.
I said we used this, used CODAP with some 8th graders a couple of weeks ago, and they had a report to write that was due a week later. And the first, we did 4th period and 5th period. And in 4th period, the teacher, our host teacher, gave them the full report template and then said, now you have 20 minutes to explore with CODAP, just kind of, you know, play around with the data, see what you can learn. And many students spent less than a minute in CODAP, dragged a couple of variables in, saw a graph, and opened up a Google Doc and started writing their report. Yeah. Whereas in the 2nd period, we gave them 5 minutes to explore, did not give them the report template at all, spent the whole 5 minutes exploring. And so it was really, it's a really nice kind of illustration of what the point that was just made. I think that was Marianne speaking, that yeah, sometimes students just want to give the answer and get their kind of student work done, and giving them that report template certainly caused them to immediately jump to, I got to write this up now. I got to spend some time on my report, and not just exploring the data and trying to answer the question that was posed. It was really surprising.
We had the exact same thing happen to us, John, because I mean, in 2017, we did like an exploratory data analysis with a roller coaster data set with just some 6th and 7th graders. And we got fantastic video. A lot of it's the video that we have in the modules. But then last year, we did almost the exact same thing you're saying, is we asked them to look for something and then create a report. And you're right, they spent all the time trying to get that Google presentation done instead of focusing on the data itself. Like, it completely
it's so interesting. It's the last thing I thought. I would never have expected that in a million years when we walked into that classroom, that students would spend so little time just trying to answer the question with the data. They just wanted to write the report.
Yeah, we had the exact same experience.
And they had a week to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So weird.
I think there's a lot to be said for saying, what do you notice? What do you wonder? And, you know, Holly Lynn in the video with roller coaster, she does such a great job of the launch in the ESTEEM materials where she shows the jackrabbit or whatever. And people really get hooked, you know, by the context, and then now they're curious, like they want to find stuff out. Might not be the question you're going to ask. And I think a lot of that falls back on us. If we give people the assignment too fast, then it's like the magic is gone.
Absolutely. Yeah, we certainly learned that lesson. And they had collected their own data. This was the psychic staring effect. So, you know, can you tell when someone's looking at the back of your head more than, you know, a chance would allow? And we thought, oh, they're going to love this. And yeah, they went right to writing the report because we gave them the report template first. It was, oops, live and learn. We changed it the next period, but yeah.
Interesting.
It's too bad. Yeah.
It could be that they just thought they knew the answer already, and they didn't need the data to answer it. I suppose it just occurred to me that maybe that's Stephanie's prior knowledge conception with the two-way tables and so on. But who knows?
Sure. Thanks. Thank you for sharing. Does anybody else have any insight here about the screencast and what they might can help us with? Okay. So if we do highly recommend you use that in the ESTEEM materials. If you do use it, you'll find out a lot, I think, about what your PSCs are thinking about. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back over to Rick. And he's going to talk about our task design assignment.
All right. Well, why do we feel like you should consider using the task design assignment? First off, we feel like having pre-service teachers engage in tasks that use technology, as well as reflecting on those tasks from a teacher's perspective, helps to prepare pre-service teachers for the similar opportunities that they'll have in the classroom. And so preparing a task will also help them to prepare to think about instruction with statistical investigations in the classroom. You know, if we contrast this to typical formative or summative assessments, pre-service teachers should be able to create alternative assessments to further their understanding of student statistical reasoning. And finally, a recent national survey found that teachers on average spend about 5 hours per week creating their own instructional materials, and that most of the materials they use in the classroom are self-created. So we feel like teachers could benefit from some guidance and reflection on how to create high quality statistical tasks.
I dropped that survey link in the notes if anybody wants it, or in the chat.
Thanks, Heather. So Heather described the task design assignment before. The purpose is really to provide pre-service teachers an opportunity to design a task that develops student statistical thinking using CODAP. I might share a little bit about a few of the parts. Part 3, we have students create a guide or a handout of the task. Different implementers have interpreted this different ways. And so some might require a separate handout. Others have allowed students to embed questions in a CODAP text box. Part 4 is where we have pre-service teachers sort of anticipate students' work. I guess I have a couple of suggestions here. One is I recommend that you have students focus on one sort of statistical question. It's more important, we feel, that they think across sort of different levels of sophistication and how a student might respond to a single question. I've noticed some students, and they interpret anticipating student work as sort of creating an answer key, and that's not our intent here. I intend to tell my class that if they have questions that are easily answered by a single answer key, then their questions may not actually be very good. Like they may not be statistical questions at all. And so that's going to be something I implement this semester. So although there are 6 parts to this assignment, there's a group of us, Heather and I are included, as well as Stephanie Casey and Taylor Harrison, that we've been focusing on analyzing pre-service teacher work on the first 3 parts here: the introductory information, the task launch, and then the student guide or handout. And so I'm going to be sharing a little bit about a research project that we have been focusing on here. And I'll be elaborating on some of our findings. So I want to share a little bit about our study first. The study involves 76 pre-service math teachers at 5 universities. And I want to emphasize here, we appreciate those of you that have shared data with us. It's helping us to learn about the pre-service teachers, and we're using some of your data for studies like this. We ended up with 73 tasks because one instructor permitted teachers to work in pairs. And our focus really is on 3 key aspects of the ESTEEM materials and how did we see those reflected in the task design assignments. Those 3 key aspects are analyzing large multivariate real data sets, creating questions where there's a continual connection to the context of the data set, and then engagement in the statistical investigative cycle, that idea posing questions, collecting data, analyzing data, and interpreting results. And so we wanted to see how these key aspects were reflected in the CODAP-enabled tasks that our pre-service math teachers submitted for the task design assignment. We're really excited that the first publication out of this task design work was just accepted for publication a few weeks ago. It will be in the site journal, Contemporary Issues in Technology and Teacher Ed, so you can look for that this summer. And I'll be sharing some of our results and some of our future work that we're working on here in the next few minutes. Our primary conclusions from this work, I want to point out several of these things are positives, because in a few minutes you may see some negatives, some critiques or areas for improvement. But there are some really positive findings that we've made from this data set. The 3 key aspects that I mentioned before, they're largely reflected in a lot of the tasks that were created by the pre-service math teachers. We saw a stronger emphasis on the first key aspect, and I'll elaborate on that use of large multivariate real data sets in a minute, and on connecting to context. We did see that there was some improvement that teachers could continue to engage in multiple parts of the statistical investigative cycle. Not all students had statistical questions that they were posing. Not all of them either engaged in data collection or unpacked the data collection process. But we did see signs that a lot of the pre-service teachers were making choices in their tasks to engage students in multiple parts of the cycle. something we were quite happy with was how knowledgeable and comfortable many of the pre-service teachers were with CODAP. And although we have some areas for improvement, it was clear that they were leaving the ESTEEM experience primarily having the ability to create a task that could engage students using CODAP. So in terms of that first key aspect, thinking about the data sets, the good news is that we saw a lot of pre-service teachers who were using data sets that were multivariate, they were pretty large and real. So if you look at the size of the data sets of the 73 tasks, the minimum number of cases was 12, the maximum was 3,100. Most of the data was between about 30 to 200 cases. You can see that in the dot plot there, average of around 304 cases. In terms of being multivariate, approximately 15 attributes were provided per case. Half included 11 or more attributes in their data set. And 79% of the data sets included both quantitative and categorical attributes. And the data sets were primarily real. 61 of them, that's 83.5%, used real data. Of those, 55 used pre-collected data, and 6 used data that were collected by students in the class. In addition to those 61 tasks, 5 other tasks generated simulated data using CODAP. You know, this is really different from the types of tasks that have traditionally appeared in textbooks. And Travis Weiland did a study about 3 years ago of secondary math textbooks. I think he compared a couple of series and found that most of the data sets that students encountered were pretty small. The median number of cases were typically between 8 to 12, and all were fewer than 20. And so if you look at his median was about 8 to 12, and our minimum was 12 cases. He also found in those traditional textbooks that most of them were either univariate or had bivariate, 2 variables, and only between 1 and 8% of the data sets had both quantitative and categorical variables in the same data set. And so I think you can start to contrast the types of activities, the types of tasks that our pre-service teachers are designing. They're using data sets that are very different than what they have probably used in the past in learning about statistics. So I think that really bodes well for us as we enter the big data era. We hope that our pre-service teachers are leaving with respect for larger real and multivariate data sets. So part 2 of the task design assignment requires students to think about how they would launch a statistical exploration. So how would they introduce the data and the data set to their students? And we saw a really wide variety of the ways that pre-service teachers planned their launch. I think, Marianne, you mentioned earlier seeing Holly Lynn in the foundation module launch a task with roller coasters. And we hope that would really provide some guidance to the pre-service teachers about how to launch a task. We would hope that they would leave with some residue of that experience and that it would be reflected in their launches. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to read through this. I know it's a little bit lengthy, but I want to give you a few minutes to read through the 2 launches, and then I'm going to ask you to compare what are the differences between the launches. So I'll give you a few minutes. So what differences do you see between launch A and launch B?
I feel like launch A is trying to kind of mimic with a video, trying to find something that can maybe grasp their attention. And B is just kind of like, hey, here's a fact.
Yeah.
We have the Olympics.
So part of the launch, we hope, is to sort of build a connection to the context, right? And I think that's kind of what you're getting at here, right? The launch A is trying to build that connection.
Yeah, they're trying to, you know, at least get them into the movie mindset. Maybe if it were me, you know, pick a specific one of these and ask them maybe some specifics about each one of those, or which one it is that you pick. But, you know, B's just like, hey, here's the Olympics. I mean, there's so much with the Olympics that we have that we could, you know, jump into with, and we've had the Olympics for so long. So I think there could definitely be some added benefits to that launch.
Okay.
Yeah, I also noticed the launch A doesn't really specify what the question is going to be before students start exploring, whereas launch B says we particularly want to look at, you know, so we're kind of narrowly focusing students' attention in launch B, whereas A is much more open.
Cammie added launch A seems like a plan. There's an engagement that will occur with students in A that will not happen in B. Both have an idea of what data will be explored, but A guides the students to being interested in actually exploring that, giving them ownership of the exploration. B imposes an exploration and will feel more like busy work. Interesting idea, yeah.
I like how A is specifically asking the specific questions. Launch B goes, we will ask questions about it. But to actually have those written out and decided upon it before you teach it, I think that helps focus your conversation in the classroom and make sure you hit on all the relevant points. So I like that Launch A specifically did those 3 bolded questions right there.
What about introducing students to the data set? So we talked a little bit about the context, the questions. How do they introduce students to the actual data set differently?
Well, one talks about the tool, you know, we're gonna look at data in CODAP, you know, it feels kind of procedural. I hadn't thought of that, you know, and I really think students are sick of analyzing gender.
Yeah. So one thing I noticed is this, and I bolded it here so that we would definitely talk about it. You know, they tried to make clear what definitions that might be confusing. For example, gross, that might be a term that they thought students might not be familiar with. That means how much money a movie makes, right? Runtime. It reminded me of the launch Holly Lynn does in the foundation module, because she talks about, well, what's an inversion, you know, and watching that video led to that question, right? So I think there's a lot of comparisons you can make between launch A and what Holly Lynn does to try to help students become familiar with the data set. That tended to be one of the big differences we noticed in the launches, that some of them really did introduce the data set and help them to think about the cases and attributes in the data set, and others didn't. You know, launch B really didn't talk about the data set at all. It didn't introduce them to the data set itself. So
that was what I was getting ready to pick up. I was getting ready to say that because it says we'll be looking at some data from the years of Olympics, where the other person says we're specifically looking 2016. Here's what, you know, we're looking at over here when it comes to the Olympics. Besides gender, I have no idea.
Yeah. So I'm going to keep us moving here. Can we? So we've identified a lot of problematic aspects, or maybe I should have labeled this differently. Maybe it would have been better for me to label it areas for improvement. But I think if you all know some of the things that we've been seeing in the task design, it may be helpful for you to support pre-service teachers who are creating these. So we kind of have divided them into some content issues and then some pedagogy issues. So one thing we noticed is a lot of the tasks didn't seem to have a driving statistical question. Only 51% of them did not have a statistical question. There were some problems with the pre-service teachers distinguishing between a categorical variable and a quantitative variable. So for example, here's a task where the students were simulating creating 10 bags of 15 M&Ms using CODAP sampler. And so in the sampler, they had colors, essentially. They were labeled BL for blue, Y for yellow, R for red, and so forth. And so the pre-service teachers asked these questions. Create a dot plot of our data. What do you notice about the shape of the distributions? You know, those are questions that we would typically associate with quantitative variables, not BL and Y. And so the questions they were posing didn't match the data that they had in this case. Didn't make sense given the categories can be rearranged in a different order, right? One of the other things we noticed is that, you know, they didn't always attend to the differences between correlation and causation. And a lot of it had to do with the way that they worded their tasks. So here's 3 examples from 3 different pre-service teachers. Select 2 quantitative variables you think have a correlation, one affecting the other, and put them into the graph. If variables have a correlation, they have a relationship and they directly impact the other. If variables are no correlation, they do not have a relationship, so they are not impacted by the other. Does the arm span of the student make a difference in the height? So the way that these questions are phrased, they're suggesting causation when they say affecting the other, directly impact, make a difference. And by the way, we did address correlation and causation in the association module in part 2. I don't think that was released when we used these tasks. So maybe if students will do the association module, we won't see that as often. Another aspect we noticed is that students didn't tend to differentiate mathematics and statistics, even though that was something we addressed in the ESTEEM materials. So how do you think that happened? Well, here's a couple of examples from pre-service teachers' questions. Were those 2 qualitative variables associated or independent? How can you prove that? Tomorrow the temperature is 90 degrees Fahrenheit and Dairy Queen wants to know how much money they will make from selling their ice cream. Write your guess for the amount that they will make and then solve for what exactly they will make for that day. So, you know, we see signs like in the second question where they're not really anticipating variability, right? Proving, solving for exactly, those types of phrases tend to suggest certainty, not uncertainty or variability. We also saw some issues with just being able to analyze the data. So analysis issues were those where the pre-service teacher didn't necessarily think through what they were asking, or their data set didn't result in the answers that they were anticipating. So I strongly encourage you to have your students work through their own problems. Have your pre-service teachers work through their questions. I'm pretty sure that some of my students and some of the students in the study didn't do that. So here are some examples. So this example is from data that was collected from the Census at School survey. If you're not familiar with Census at School, they essentially have students from around the country and really around the world submit answers to the same questions. So for example, the data in this question included data about how many hours per week students reported hanging out with their friends, and how many hours per week they were working for pay. And so what do you see here? Write down some notes, ask a question. So these are questions that the pre-service teacher is asking. So here was the graph I created to try to answer this. You might notice some issues here. So, oh, sorry. Trying to do too many things here. You might notice some issues here. So first off, there's some messy data involved. The messy data actually resulted in a categorical variable. So if you notice along the bottom of the screen, can you see that right now?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, you can see the bottom? Okay, you might notice that some of the data was inputted as like 4 to 5, 4-5. One of the data points was 5 1/6. And so it ended up creating a categorical variable. Now you could have treated it as quantitative, but I'm pretty sure that's not what the pre-service teacher had intended, because if you look at question B, it says click on the ruler icon and click on the median. Why are so many medians 0? To me, that's an interesting question. Why are so many medians 0? There should be one median for paid work hours, right? Should be one median for hours of hanging out with friends, but because it's being treated as categorical, they're seeing more than one median in their data representation.
Can't help but wonder what they thought the answer to that question was. Why are so many medians 0? Or was that just a question for the teacher? I don't know how to answer that.
No, there's also some, John, you were talking about messy data earlier. There's some messy things here. If you look at the possible answers that are given, like for hanging out with friends, they spend 300 hours per week hanging out with their friends. That's impossible because there's not 300 hours in a week. Someone else said 170, 120 paid work hours. So there's, I guess the moral of the story here is that we just saw students submit data sets that weren't clean and weren't ready really for students. Here's another example. In this example, they didn't consider the student choices. So they gave some students some choices about what kind of attribute to choose. However, the follow-up questions didn't consider the student choices, or they made assumptions about what kinds of attributes or representations students would choose. So for example, I did this with 2 variables for a data set that was about 400 graduate school applicants. It included 8 attributes, and students were asked to choose 2 of the attributes and analyze the bivariate data for form, strength, and direction. Well, I did the graph on the right over here. And so 2 of the attributes that I chose, one was research, which was binary. It indicated whether the applicant had had prior research experience or not. And then the variable SOP was the applicant's score on their statement of purpose, which it appears to be on a scale from 1 to 5. Now, I'll re-emphasize, this represents 400 applicants. If you look, it only looks about like 18 dots because they're essentially layered on top of one another. So this is not really the best choice for 2 attributes. And so the questions that the pre-service teacher posed to analyze it for form, strength, and direction, it didn't always make sense given that the student could have chose these as possible attributes. I will admit, in the pre-service teacher's defense here, there were other quantitative variables that would have allowed for this kind of analysis, but our thinking is that pre-service teachers need to anticipate the different types of choices that students might make. Like I said earlier, there were also some pedagogical issues. For example, a lot of their questions were unclear. Writing good statistical questions is hard work. I know when Stephanie and I were trying to write the association module, it was difficult to come up with good questions all the time. We would write tasks and revise them. And so it should come really is no surprise that some of our pre-service teachers had struggles with this as well. In other cases, they also had questions that students were unprepared to answer. Either maybe they didn't have the contextual support needed, or they didn't have the content support needed. So for example, the problem here on the left, this was a data set that involved the 64 teams in the NCAA tourney. And so they asked questions like, what 4 teams have the greatest number of losses and the least number of wins? Well, when you look at the data set, what 4 teams have the greatest number of losses? There are really 5 teams that had the greatest number of losses. And they were not the teams that had the least number of wins, not directly at least, some of them were. If you look at the least number of wins, there was one team that had, looks like 17, and then a collection of 5 that had 19. So this question was really worded in kind of a awkward way, right? The same pre-service teacher also later in the activity asked students to create a graph with the variable rank in region and team, and now it's time to complete your bracket. That was the first mention in their entire lesson of the word bracket. And so for someone not familiar with that context, which might be a lot of students, right? They had no clue really what to do in that case. On the right, this is a case where we didn't feel like the content support was necessarily provided. You know, they had students fill out a table that this table comes from the Titanic data set. So they were comparing class versus survival rate. And so they asked students to fill in the table below that shows the joint relative frequencies, the marginal relative frequencies. It says use the ruler feature in order to find the joint and marginal relative frequencies. And then they go on to ask them to write statements about joint, marginal, and conditional. A couple of things I found interesting here. The number 8 really doesn't support a conditional frequency easily. You could calculate it, but it didn't support it like right away. The other interesting thing I found in number 8, they're essentially suggesting to use the ruler feature. I assume that's referring to CODAP. And CODAP actually does not include a feature to find the marginal relative frequency easily either. You can do it, but it's not as easy as some of the other options here to find the joint or the conditional. You know, I saw other cases where they would suggest to do things in CODAP, like find the mode or the mid-range in CODAP, and those aren't options to find in CODAP either. So given that students really didn't have the background they needed, or they didn't have the tools in CODAP to answer the questions. We also saw examples where pre-service teachers focused too much on computation or CODAP use. Here's an example where they really focused on questions that said, describe how you chose to create a graph using the class data, what graph tools did you use in CODAP. These really didn't focus on analysis or interpretation of the data. I think later the same teacher did have some interpretation questions, but these were certainly focused more on CODAP use than on making interpretations. So those were some of the problematic aspects that we have. I think I'm going to let Heather share about the reflection. So I'm going to stop sharing, Heather, and let you take over. Reflecting on implementation. Did we lose Heather? Well, I guess we lost Heather. I'll continue on then. So we're going to share a little bit about implementing the Screencast assignment before we end here. Christina Asme, which some of you met whenever we were doing the workshops at A&T in past years. Christina is going to share a little bit about how she implemented the screencast. And this was an earlier draft of the screencast assignment. Christina finished her PhD in math and stats education from NC State last year. Her dissertation focused on secondary math, pre-service teachers' development of statistics, teaching self-efficacy. So we're going to see what Christina has to share about her implementation.
Hello, my name is Christina Asney, and I'm an assistant professor of teacher education at Catawba College in Salisbury, North Carolina. This is my first year teaching here. I just graduated in the summer from NC State University, where I was a graduate student in mathematics education. And during my time there, I was either a TA or the instructor of an online course where I implemented the Screencast assignment. That course was mostly asynchronous with approximately bi-weekly synchronous sessions. And I gave this Screencast assignment after about 5 weeks of material on teaching statistics with technology. In terms of what I emphasized to the students when they were completing the assignment, I emphasized that they should use the Screencast for 2 main purposes. The first being to show what they were able to do using the software, which was CODAP in this case. And the second purpose would be to model statistical habits of mind. And I did suggest to them on the rubric and when discussing the assignment that they should practice their screencast before recording it. I also described the assignment when I was describing the assignment to them verbally. This was not on the written assignment. I described it as sort of a way to practice a teaching demonstration to a student if they were a teacher. If they had a student who had been absent for the day and the class had done a statistical investigation, this was sort of a video they could record in order to have the student sort of make up the day. The data sets that the students used, the majority of the students used the roller coaster data set, but the state education data set and the vehicles data set was also used by some of the students. In terms of things that I noticed about the screencast submissions, one major thing I noticed was that it was very clear who had practiced and who had not. In addition, it was also very clear the students who purposefully had planned to include language demonstrating statistical habits of mind and who had planned on using more advanced features of the technology. For example, creating hierarchical tables and creating new columns with formulas. On the other hand, some students took a more minimalistic approach and investigated data mainly by overlaying measures of center and spread and answering the statistical questions sort of deterministically. So for example, many of the students, when they were asked to compare the top speed of older roller coasters versus newer roller coasters versus more recent roller coasters, their method was to compare the numerical values of the means, and their sort of determination at the end of comparing those was that, yes, more recent roller coasters are faster. For grading the screencasts, I used a rubric to grade the screencast. The major things I looked for when grading the screencast was, number one, I asked them to identify a common core mathematical standard that might match the task they chose, and I was looking to see if there was a match there. Number two, I was looking at what types of ways they used the technology and if they demonstrated any advanced skills. Number three, I was looking at if they used appropriate statistical language and if they demonstrated statistical habits of mind. And then finally, I was looking if their video was the appropriate time length of around 10 minutes. I think that this assignment was really worthwhile in allowing pre-service teachers to investigate real data and also express their thinking in a way that was different than sort of the written investigations that I asked them to do in the course. Because in this assignment, they were asked to sort of communicate in real time and to consider the audience that would be watching the screencast later. And I also think it was useful because it sort of takes away some of the obstacles that a live presentation or demonstration might present for students who might find that sort of assignment anxiety producing. In addition, that recorded aspect of it allows or encourages pre-service teachers to plan their investigation rather than doing it on the fly, which we know is sort of an important skill for pre-service teachers to have, is sort of that planning aspect of it. Although I will say not all my students took heed to the suggestion to plan and practice the investigation before they recorded.
Okay.
Hello.
Hey, Christina. So Christina did, I hope Rick mentioned this, but she had was one of the first ones to implement the Screencast assignment in her course. So the current Screencast assignment as it stands now is a lot of what she suggested that we add on to it. So for example, we have in there now like a link to the SASE framework so that students can get a refresher if they haven't seen the habits of mind and that sort of thing to incorporate into their investigation. So that's in there as well now. But this is the rubric she mentioned that she used. So this is, again, in all of our task design assignment and our Screencast assignment, we don't have rubrics in place so that there is more autonomy meant for the math teacher educators to implement it. But this is the one she used. You can see it's very simple. She didn't have a lot of detail to it. I think, Rick, you had some sort of rubric too that you said was sort of generic like this as well. But you can definitely take a look at this if you want to. We had another instructor that taught this course at NC State after her, and he used this same rubric too. No, it's not in the ESTEEM materials, John. We haven't put the rubric in there. We are planning on doing something next, and we're not sure if that's going to be like a facilitator's guide or that sort of thing, but as of right now, there are no scoring rubrics in any of the assignments.
I will say this is one of those tasks that might depend on your course, right? If you're teaching a content-focused course, you may choose to look at different things than if you're teaching a methods course.
Or like if it's a statistical thing or something, because this was also taught at NC State on one of the courses that's just teaching math or technology in general. So it wasn't statistics focused at all, but it was in the section that was on the statistics piece. Yeah, feel free to take the screenshot. We'll share this, whole PowerPoint will be online.
So we just have a couple minutes left, but I do want to open up for any questions that anyone has or final comments about either the Screencast assignment, the task design, or really any of the ESTEEM modules. Anything that we haven't covered today that you'd like to share or talk about?
I'll mention too, just to put it out there, we are working on organizing all the videos we have for ESTEEM into an ESTEEM YouTube channel that we have. And one of the playlists we have right now is CODAP tutorials. And hearing, especially what you all were talking about with students or teachers having problems loading in data set and trying to parse through data, I think that might be an interesting video to sort of have on there for them to be able to do that. Because it's something that I think we might take you know, we don't think about when we're doing it ourselves.
I think that would be helpful. I was not in the beginning of the call. Is there a way with ESTEEM, and I should know this, I'm just going to say that, is there a way that we can get the materials without importing them to our course, like our LMS system?
We've been talking about that a lot, about how you can access. Certainly, if you go to the Moodle site, you can download any of our materials there.
Okay.
If there's something that you need, feel free to reach out and contact one of us on the project, and I think we can find a way to get it to you. But we also have been talking about creating another site. We do have a YouTube channel for the ESTEEM, so you can access all our videos there.
I put the link to the playlist for the CODAP one specifically, but you can go and look at all of our playlists for all the videos as well.
Except videos that have students, we can't publicly.
Anything that has like classroom with students visible, with those are unlisted, but you can see them in the materials themselves.
But all of our other videos are publicly available there.
Yeah.
So we want to thank you for your participation. I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes if you have other questions.